Well, as you can see, we are dressed out, ready for Steeler playoff time.
Yeah, it's that time of year, big game coming up.
Yeah, we're big fans here in the house, and I've got this used to be Rod Woodson's number, and now it's Le'Veon Bell's number, and Leah Beth is actually wearing a jersey that I wore when I was a kid in pickup football games. It's Franco Harris's number.
One sleeve ripped out.
Obviously got ripped off when I was making an incredible play or something.
I'm sure. Sure it was, dear.
Anyway, so we're pretty souped up.
Well, you were a Steeler fan for years.
Oh, I was a fan from my young childhood. Matter of fact, and I don't want to go into the details of it, but I actually got to talk to Terry Bradshaw his last season. My mom, James Carter, a friend of mine, and I called the hotel that the Steelers were staying at in Cleveland, person to person, to Terry Bradshaw, and he answered the phone.
That's crazy.
Spent about 10 or 15 minutes talking with us. My sister still holds it over my head today that we didn't let her talk. She was in the house and nobody thought to give her a shot at it. But just a great childhood memory.
Cool.
Really fun stuff.
You've got some other good stories from your family, don't you?
I love to tell stories, and there's a story today I really wanted to share it. It's an old family story, but it's a true story. And it really is a story that I look back to, and think it had a significant part in the reason why our family is believers to this day. But years ago, well before I was born, my great-grandmother was stricken with rheumatoid arthritis. And it was a very rapidly progressing situation. She went from being healthy to being curled up in a bed, in essence, with her hands and her feet like this. We've all seen folks in that condition. And she became a cripple almost overnight. And at that time, they didn't have anything that they could really treat her with. They did tell her, they said, we can break the bones in your hands and your feet and set them straight so they'll look normal, but you'll always be an invalid. She was in tremendous pain. If she even needed to go to the restroom, she had to be carried. And her family, she had three boys and a husband, and they weren't very old. My grandfather was the oldest, and he was maybe 20 years old. And she was in a hopeless situation. And a friend of hers came to the house and said, there is a preacher in town that's going around, and he's praying for the sick, and they're being healed. Would you like him to come, to your house? And she said, yes, please. So this fella shows up at the house, and he gathers the whole family in her bedroom. And the three boys and the husband were not Christians. My great-grandmother was a believer, but the rest of the family was not. And he began to go over the scriptures with the family and talk to them about the fact that Jesus was a healer, that everywhere he went, he healed the sick. And then he talked about how Jesus commissioned his followers to go out and heal the sick, and talked about talked about anointing with oil and that type of thing. And he said, we're going to pray for your mom and believe that Jesus is going to heal her of this condition. My grandfather, he just wasn't sure he could trust this guy. And he said his mom was in such excruciating pain, he was worried that the guy was actually going to cause her pain. So when the fella said, let's bow our heads and pray, my grandfather bowed his head, but he did it like this. He put his head down, but his eyes were wide open. And he told me, he said, if that guy hurt my mom, I was just gonna whip him. So he didn't have to, though. He said, as that fellow reached out to begin to pray for his mom, he said the moment his hand touched her, he said all of a sudden before his eyes, he said those hands and those feet, as gnarled up as they were, they began to open up just like this, and they were perfect. My mom had told me that the one thing she remembered about her grandmother was she had the most beautiful hands you ever see, instantly healed. She sat up in bed, and the preacher said, do you have any pain anywhere? And she said, well, I've got one small pain in my back. He said, well, I think if Jesus healed the other, he can certainly take care of that. They prayed for that. She was healed. Needless to say, the whole family became believers that day. My grandfather went on to become a preacher. He just died a few years ago at the age of 101 years old. But I've often looked back at that story and thought, that changed the destiny of our family. He became a believer. He raised his children as believers, and they raised their kids in the same manner, and we're raising our kids in the same way. And we can point back and look back to a single miracle that has impacted generations. And I love to think back, on that story. And it makes me think of something that happened at our last crusade that we did in India. I took Violet on that crusade, and we did it in northern India.
Wasn't it 2014?
It was August of 2014,
Mm-hmm.
and at the end of preaching, we always pray for the sick, and we'll give opportunities for people to come up and testify to things that have happened. And there was a lady that came up, and she came up with her daughter, and the lady was older. Her daughter was maybe in her mid-20s or early 30s, and the lady looked absolutely in shock. But the daughter was just crying, which is kind of unusual in India because sometimes they don't express as much emotion, even if they've received a great miracle or something exciting's happened. But the daughter just cried, and she began to tell us the story of her mom, and it sounded eerily similar or gloriously similar to my great-grandmother. And she said that her mom was a crippled, and it sounded, I don't know if the diagnosis was rheumatoid arthritis, but a total invalid, crippled up. And she even said if her mom had to be carried to go somewhere, she had to be carried by either the daughter or her husband. And she'd come to the crusade that night, and when prayer had been made, those crippled up joints became wonderful.
Wow.
She was able to walk, and she was instantly healed in a moment. So after she shared this testimony, of course, I just felt like crying during it. But I said, I've got a story to tell you. And I began to tell her, as well as the crowd, about the miracle that had happened in my great-grandmother's life. And I've looked back on that and thought how that miracle will affect generations of her family.
That's true.
In 100 or 80 years, 100 years, they may be talking about their great-grandmother that was healed by Jesus and how it changed the destiny of that family. So it's good to know that God is still a miracle-working God.
That's right.
And that He's good.